Most, if not all, policy ideas can easily be identified on the spectrum known in political circles as the Overton window, namely the spectrum that goes from unthinkable to established policy. We also know that there is no such thing as new ideas, only repackaging of old ones, and that the spectrum can shift. What's unthinkable today may be the policy of tomorrow and the other way around. What we don't know yet is how to identify ideas that are likely to progress from unthinkable towards acceptable. We do know that nearly any idea can travel this path, but there is still no method to discriminate between likelihoods and let alone ascertain it. Sure, we can use experience to make educated guesses. For instance, it is pretty safe to bet that the policy of adopting the gold standard won't be making out of the unacceptable box anytime soon anywhere. Just like it's pretty safe bet that policies, restrictions, and procedural aspects of abortion will continue to change in multiple places on the planet for many years to come, as it's a complicated moral conundrum that cannot really be solved but merely managed. But how about voting rights for businesses? This is the kind of policy you expect to read about in autistic libertarian forums, or some other marginal circles. It's a policy idea that's been hovering between unacceptable and radical for almost 100 years, not to mention it was straight up unheard of before the 18th century. Yet, it's almost policy now in Delaware. How did that happen? And what can it mean? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so the long-winded introduction was meant to put some context around the topic. The context being that we'd really need a method to guess better which ideas and policies are most likely to be repackaged and reattempted. In early July of 2023, a measure to allow municipalities in Delaware to extend the right to vote in local elections to businesses has passed a key hurdle. Simply put, it's more likely than not at this point that the definition of a voter for the purposes of local elections to include artificial entities such as businesses, LLCs, partnerships, and trusts. Now, if this had been attempted in California or in a European country, perhaps it wouldn't be such a big deal. But Delaware is a global business hub. Almost anyone from almost any country on earth can set up an LLC in Delaware. That's why the state has twice as many businesses as it has people. And the number of businesses continues to grow thanks to its business-friendly institutions and legal framework. Besides, it's much easier to make legal entities than to make people. Left-wing criticism to the policy asserts that letting businesses vote in municipal elections dilutes the voice of the citizenry and, quote, puts the idea that corporations are people on steroids, unquote, a form of criticism that simply misses the point. The legal precedent of corporations are people is based on the very real aspects that all corporations are formed by people. And if 20 people are allowed to speak individually, why shouldn't they be allowed to speak collectively if their collective is called Corporation of the 20 LLC? Also, if 20 people are allowed individually to financially support an issue, why shouldn't the same 20 people be allowed to pool their resources and support the same issue more effectively? So the criticism of the Delaware measure through the lens of corporations are people on steroids misses the point. The point of voting, as understood at this moment, is a slow evolution of one man, one vote, basically. And either intrinsically or explicitly, voting is tied to citizenship and preferably some physical connection to the place. Everywhere on Earth, there is a process when it comes to local elections that tries as best as it can to tie the individual to that community, usually by means of ID or official address. The measure in Delaware tries to do the same for artificial entities. The LLC should own property in the city, therefore a physical connection, in addition to being registered there, therefore an ID. But what it doesn't do is place limits on citizenship, and this is really the innovation. Because otherwise, the idea of business voting is not exactly new either. During the fascist rule in Italy, there was such thing as the Chamber of Corporations that represented trades and industries and was, for all intents and purposes, voted in by corporations. Portugal's upper house of parliament was called the Corporative Chamber and existed until 1974, and again it was voted in by corporations, but it served a more consultative role, similar to the House of Lords in Britain. Instances of de facto corporate vote can be found in late 19th century as well, but all of these examples predate the ability of anyone from anywhere to form a corporation in a place that allows voting for corporations. In other words, fascist Italy's Chamber of Corporations could not be easily subverted by a bunch of foreigners opening up firms in the country, but now such thing would be possible. Now, in the intro, I asked how did that happen and what can it mean? The first question is easy. Nearly everyone on Earth became richer, and thus the need to effectively move capital has increased in ways simply unimaginable in the 19th century. And since it's easier to move some paperwork, even if physically, than to change centuries of established societal standards, the need for jurisdictions friendly to such things kept on increasing. And when that need became big enough, ways to fulfill it appeared. For a while, we called such places tax havens, but that's really a misnomer given by greedy politicians and other socialists. Jurisdictions with friendly institutions don't always have low taxes, and such jurisdictions don't appear out of thin air. Heck, some of them are in fact ruled by socialists. They appear because there are incentives for them to continue to exist. Add some technology to that and here's your answer. That's how it happened. The much harder question is, what can this mean? For the time being, it is still unclear whether this measure in Delaware even passes or not, although, again, it's more likely than not that it will. But a line has been crossed. Corporation voting rights now has a meaning for a lot of people that it did not have last year or 5 years ago. Unless you are 90 years old, it is very likely that you've never lived in a place in which the concept of corporate voting rights was used outside of the context of corporate and contract law. And with this line crossed, the idea is no longer unthinkable. It now hovers between radical and acceptable. Now, this doesn't mean it will become policy tomorrow. It may not even become policy in Delaware this decade, let alone everywhere else. But it does mean that there is a new policy piece on the chessboard. Sure, we could say that there are so many aspects of such a policy that are unacceptable to so many mainstream and non-mainstream schools of thought that there may indeed be enough opposition to it that it won't spread. But I don't think so. 2 words: gay marriage. Way too many people forgot, or simply don't know, just how radical this idea is and has always been. In fact, the idea of gay marriage is so radical that it was unthinkable even to gay rights activists themselves as late as 1986. Imagine that. Less than 40 years ago, not even the most explicit pro-perversion advocates dared to speak about gay marriage. That's how radical this idea is. As late as March 2001, exactly 0 countries on Earth recognized gay marriage. As of August 2023, merely 17% of the people on Earth live in a country that recognizes such an extraordinarily radical idea as policy. I think that corporate voting rights can follow a very similar pattern. It may not become policy this decade, but there's no reason to assume it can't be policy, at least in some places, in 2050. Look, I'm not here to tell you this is a good thing or a bad thing. Heck, I'm very far from being a fan of democracy. I'd renounce my right to vote in the blink of an eye with the right incentives, and I never made any qualms about the fact that I hold the universal right to vote in utter contempt. And I'm definitely not the only one. In fact, I sometimes jokingly say that the majority disagree with the universal right to vote. It's just that we don't agree yet on how to change things. Corporate voting rights appears to me, and please tell me in the comments if you think I'm wrong, but the attempt appears to me as one of the many attempts to restore some balance. And since getting the system to accept more restrictions on the franchise, such as the restricting the right to vote only to taxpayers, which would be very fair but understandably unpopular, the next best thing is to add to the system. If in a city 30% are business owners and 70% are a drain on the tax revenue, universal voting rights nearly guarantees the financial collapse of that city. The 70% will vote themselves more and more privileges at the expense of the 30% until the 30% either leave or go bankrupt. But if every business that owns property in the city also gets an equal vote, then suddenly the equation is a bit more balanced. Though technically this isn't an equation, but an inequality. Anyway, mathematical precision aside, it is easy to see why such a measure in some localities may be seen as a very good thing. The trade-off, of course, will be very similar, and by that I mean similarly bad, with what has been going on with the welfare state. The original proponents of the welfare state didn't take into consideration that people can move in both directions. The very rich move away because they're sick and tired of being robbed, and the very poor move in so they can cash in on the benefits. Over a long enough timeline, this only ends in misery, especially when combined with universal voting rights. This was seen as not a big issue 70 years ago because moving was harder. But as present day clearly shows, having open borders and a welfare state is just not working. The same trade-off will be faced with corporate voting rights. Yes, the 30% in the fictional city I talked about earlier will balance the inequality through such a measure. But what happens when an equal or higher number of hostile corporations join the game? Let's say 1 million Chinese corporations set up shop in a city of 10,000 people, and each buy a 1 square meter plot of land, or one apartment. It doesn't say anywhere what kind of property, right? What if then, democratically, those Chinese corporations vote in mandatory Chinese language usage in administration, a mayor from the CCP, and an exemption from sanctions? If you think far enough, such a system, like the one proposed in Delaware, can very easily end up in a nightmare. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I haven't seen this facet of the issue covered anywhere. And that's because most proponents and most people who oppose the measure tend to be self-observed. Contrary to popular opinion, geostrategic considerations aren't exactly a big concern among too many of the thinkers in the West. They should be, but they're not, and haven't been so in decades. Heck, the words national security are almost an insult in the United States, and not without reason. I mean, politicians have used national security way too many times to restrict freedom. Nevertheless, the issue is still real. So, should businesses vote? I don't know. But what I do know is that the case against this measure's long march through institutions is, for the time being, very weak. That doesn't mean the case for it is strong, but the underlying reasons behind it are indeed very strong. You have to keep in mind that authoritarianism is the norm. Tyranny is the entropy. So if you want to prevent tyranny, you have to guard liberty every day. And to be fair, a bad job has been done about that. Universal suffrage also isn't helping. So if you want to stop corporate voting rights, you'd better start thinking of ways to curb universal suffrage. I don't know how this will end. Let's hope I'm entirely wrong and the measure in Delaware fails at the last moment, never to be spoken about ever again. If we had a method to ascertain this, which I just said in the intro that we don't, then this video would have never existed. But since we don't have such a method, we have to admit that this may now be an issue far more serious than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And if it will not be treated with the seriousness it deserves, it will eventually generate consequences. Some of them even very hard to even imagine at this point. So yeah. Not exactly a video with definitive conclusions because it's far from an easy topic. Now you tell me, how much of a good idea is for businesses to have a vote? And under what circumstances? Let's have that conversation, as minimal as it may be, in this tiny, forgotten corner of the internet. And with that said, I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.